thanks for the invitation to talk here, and thanks to you all again for coming. Yes, I am a Mancunian, and I've been in Cape Town now for 43 years, and it is like coming home again. And there's also something about the connection between being an undergraduate in England and then going to Cape Town that has some resonance in what I'm going to talk about tonight. I'm going to talk about a site that we're excavating not far from Cape Town, about 200 kilometers from Cape Town. But it's one of a number of sites, as you'll see, that is relevant to the issue of where did our species come from? Where did we come from? Becoming us, if you like. The site is called Diepkloof. That's the cave or rock shelter. You'll see it's a very large rock shelter. And we've got quite an extensive excavation there, which we're doing with some French colleagues, and I'll acknowledge them just now. And just one other term on that first slide, which I think I need to explain before we get going. The Middle Stone Age. Typically for archaeologists, we subdivide the past into various ways. In Africa, we talk about the early, middle and later Stone Age, whereas in Europe you might talk about the lower, middle and upper Paleolithic. Very similar, but not quite the same. And the Middle Stone Age, then, it describes, or it refers to stone artifact assemblages from about 35,000 years ago back to about 250,000 years ago. And the key thing is that for much of that time, for the early part of that period, what's happening in the places that I'm going to describe are not very different from what you'd get if you're talking to a French archaeologist or a German archaeologist or any European archaeologist about the Paleolithic of Europe. But towards the end of that period, some things start to happen that are very interesting and I think very important in terms of the origin of our species. And the things are both biological and behavioral. It's quite complicated, I think. Keep my eye on lots of things here. I want to start by acknowledging all the people, because obviously, like most archaeological excavations and analyses, there are a lot of people involved. The excavations that I'm going to talk about are a joint initiative between the University of Bordeaux and the University of Cape Town. The chef de mission on the French side was initially Jean-Philippe Rigaud. He's now retired, so he's not allowed to raise the funds that are necessary. So he's passed the baton over to Pierre-Jean Texier. And from the South African side, Cedric Porkenpool, who is senior, or has been, he's just retired actually, senior technician in the archaeology department. Martin knows him well in Cape Town. And a whole lot of other people who are part of the excavation team or who are geologists looking at the sourcing of the rocks that people use to make their artifacts, or dating people. Chantal and Norbert there are people who date these we're beyond the range of radiocarbon dating, so we need something else. And Chantal and Norbert use a kind of thermoluminescence dating. They date pieces of burnt stone in the sediments. And the two people below, Zenobia and Anne, some of you may know Anne, she was at Aberystwyth for a long time, and her student Zenobia, who's now in Australia, they date by optically stimulated luminescence. They date sediments in which these artifacts that I'm going to describe are found. The interesting thing is that those two techniques are not quite telling the same story at the moment. It's very interesting, and I'll get back to that later. Then Richard Klein and Teresa look at the bones. Alex Mackay is an Australian postdoc student from ANU who looks at stone artifacts. Caroline Cartwright is a former student of ours at UCT, University of Cape Town. She's now in the British Museum Research Labs, and so on and so forth. Chris Miller, Paul Goldberg look at sediments, and me. So there's a big team, a lot of French, a lot of people from North America, and it's very much a collaborative operation. And sometimes one forgets to thank all these people, so I thought I'd put it up right up front so you know. Well, when I was an undergraduate, I mean, we knew some things, not as much as I would like to think as we know now. And, you know, certainly, Martin will remember this, in the department where we were, there was a very strong emphasis on the Dordogne, on these beautiful cave paintings of southern France and northern Spain, and all the kind of creative explosion of the Upper Paleolithic. But we did know, even then, that things didn't really begin there. Our species can't have been, can't have evolved in Europe. And that's primarily because from about 40,000 years back, all the skeletal remains in Europe are Neanderthal. So this is really a Neanderthal continent. And very rapidly, between about 40 and 30,000 years ago, Neanderthal people in Europe were very rapidly replaced by people who look like us. Neanderthal people don't look like us. They're distinguishable physically, cranially and postcranially. And of course, now that we didn't have it then, but now that we've got all this genetic information, the geneticists can suggest that the separation of people who would become Neanderthals from people who would become us is very ancient, perhaps 500,000 or 600,000 years ago. So Europe was a continent of Neanderthals until about 40,000 years ago. Then, apparently very rapidly, they were replaced by modern people. And it was not only a biological replacement, but with the so-called Upper Paleolithic modern people, you had all of the cave paintings, you had all of these beautiful pieces of decorated bonework, carvings in bone and ivory and soft stone and even clay. You had beads, necklaces, you had burials with very elaborate strewing of ochre and so on. So we knew back then, we could see that if we were looking for the origins of our species, there was not going to be much point in looking in Europe. We thought of the Near East because, well, we always thought of the Near East, you know, I mean, that was the kind of nearest place. You can't think of the Near West, you know, I mean, Europe's is just wonderful cul-de-sac. So, but that didn't look too promising, but we were just puzzled, okay? I'm talking about the 60s. So the origins of our species is somehow bound up with some physical changes, but it's also bound up with some behavioral changes which involve a whole lot of decorative material. And that's really a contribution that we can make recently from Southern Africa. And if you know the literature, you'll know that there are a lot of things happening in Southern Africa that are providing important evidence on this. It's a bit strange, really, that one should be looking right at the furthest part of Africa. And I should say, there are, if somebody else were giving this lecture, somebody from East Africa, then they would be making a case for East Africa. It's a different case. It's very different from the case that I'll make. If you want to make a case for the origins of our species in East Africa, you're very much reliant on the biological evidence, on apparently anatomically modern cranial parts that are apparently very, very ancient. These, by and large, are crania that were not excavated carefully in the field, but have been subsequently analysed by people who can, you know, scrape bits of dirt out of the inside of the cranium and use perhaps thermoluminescence, no, more likely OSL, to date the cranium. If I'm sounding skeptical, it's because I am. I'm not sure that I'd like to be. I'd much rather be making our case than that case. North Africa, very interesting. Mediterranean, Atlantic North Africa, recently some very interesting finds there. But there are no Neanderthals in Africa, and the biological development in Africa has clearly been persistently and systematically towards us. So we know that we are Africans. We know. It's not, there's no doubt about that. What we need to know is what part of Africa, when, and under what circumstances, and the kind of, and I'm going to talk about that just now. There's a lot of activity at the moment in the south. This is a map actually made by the French colleagues, and the detail's not that important, but those yellow stars that you see are some of the sites that are being currently excavated by South African archaeologists, but in collaboration with Americans and Canadians and Europeans and Australians. There's a lot of activity because it's become very clear that these sites are interesting in that they have that package of elements that we see in Europe arriving between 40 and 35,000 years ago. But they have them much earlier than that. That replacement, by the way, is puzzling because presumably if Neanderthal people evolved in Europe and are to some extent adapted to European circumstances, how come they got you know, eliminated so rapidly? How come in 10,000 years you move from a situation where you've only got Neanderthal people to a situation where you really haven't got any at all? It's like City regularly and substantially beating United year in, year out. You know, it needs an explanation, right? I'm a City supporter, let me just make it very clear. Now, the fact that we have sites all over southern Africa, but the key sites turn out to be these near coastal sites that are near the coast at the moment. Of course, over the last 120,000 years, glaciers have been advancing, sea levels have been going up and down, and those sites were not always at the coast or near to the coast. The issue of why some of this early innovative behavior, along with skeletal remains of people who are like us, why that should appear down there is somehow is tied up with some environmental changes as well. In particular, we know that for much of the last few 100,000 years, perhaps 85% of it, the world does not look like the way it does today. Sea levels have been lower, the glaciers have been advanced, and the edges of the continents have been very different. This is what southern Africa looked like at the times of glacial advance, when sea levels were, this is the 120-meter contour, and that would have been where the coastline was about 20,000 years ago, and between 100,000 years and 20,000 years ago, the coastline would have moved from its present position down to this kind of position. Now that's important. It means that we've probably lost a lot of information, which is now buried under the sea. But there's another important correlate of this, and that is that when the glaciers advance in the northern hemisphere and sea levels drop, southern Africa becomes extremely arid. Most of the interior here is pretty arid anyway. But if you lower the temperatures of the oceans, then much less moisture is advected off those oceans and transported on land. It's much drier, and effectively, this part of Africa would have been very, very, very substantially isolated from the rest of Africa by extreme aridity, which pinched, if you like, pinched Africa. Probably there was virtually no connection in the West, and there were probably narrow lines of connection allowing genetic exchange, but also cultural, behavioral exchanges in the East. The same would have been true of North Africa. So Africa, for much of the last few 100,000 years, not been one place, it's been 3 places at least. And these were kind of repetitive isolations and reconnections. I think that's probably quite important in terms of making a story about how modern people evolved and where. What really characterizes modern people is the level of encephalization. It's the relative brain to body weight. That's what really characterizes us. We have a brain that's far too big for our bodies. Or we have a body that's far too small for our brain, I suppose, but whatever way you want to look at it, and it's not really satisfactory only to look at the size of the brain. Our brain is very large for us as a terrestrial mammal. It's much larger than you would anticipate from our average body weight. But probably if we could, in fossil remains, look at the complexity and the connectedness of those brains, we'd probably find that it's even more dramatically different from what you'd expect from a terrestrial mammal of about 65 kilograms. This is what makes us remarkable. And of course that was visible already in the 60s when we noted that those modern people in Europe were doing all that stuff with beads and decoration and wall paintings and so on. So, what have we got? I'm going to talk about this site, Diepkloof, which is here. It's about 17 kilometers from the coast at the moment. Probably at various stages in the past it's been further from the coast. And some of these other caves are sites that are being currently excavated. And together they make a very powerful case that there were some things happening here 60, 70, 80,000 years ago which are reminiscent of the things that emerge in Europe, but far earlier. site. Diepkloof is here. And this is what the cave looks like. Actually, two very large rock shelters in this rocky outcrop. A very large one here. These are created by very large blocks of stone falling down, and in some cases tumbling down the slope, but in other cases, in the case of that big set of blocks there, falling and staying in place. And the occupation area in this cave is behind these big rocks, behind the rock, between the rocks and the back wall of the shelter there. There's another shelter here, which is also very big, created in the same way, which also has a very interesting sequence. But this is the one that we've been focusing on. These are plans of the two caves. That's the one we're not going to talk about. This is the main one. This is a gridded, it's quite a big cave, a bit bigger than this room, I guess. And these are square meters. And we had excavated in the 1970s in here when we were interested in other things. We were interested in the last 2,000 or 3,000 years. But recently we've started to excavate over a bigger area, and we've now got a very clear understanding of the sequence of deposition, the occupation history of the site, if you like, because of our excavation since about 1998 with the University of Bordeaux team. So we have a large excavation over here. The reason the excavation is shaped the way it is that we'd found we came to the site one day, we found a little hole over here. It looked as though an animal had dug a burrow and tipped out some of the sediment. And when we looked at what was in that sediment, it was very different from the kinds of things we've been excavating over here. And we were puzzled as to why things that apparently were on the same level looked very different. The charcoal looked different, the bones looked different, the stone artifacts looked different. We were a bit puzzled. In fact, it was simply because although the surface of the cave is very flat, in fact the depositional build-up in the cave has been very irregular. And so you simply don't get an idea of the whole sequence of events in the cave if you just make an excavation here. You have to actually, and this trench was excavated in order to link these circumstances over here with these over here. This is the only excavation that I've got that's named after me. Very proud of that. The French decided that was Sondage Parkington. That is in fact Sondage Parkington over here. This is Jean-Philippe Rigaud and the students. This is Cedric Pockenpool excavating here. So you'll recognise there was the main excavation that we had, and here's Cedric digging a trench to join it to the other excavation over here. Another view. So Jean-Philippe, this is Pierre-Jean Texier here, and the trench that linked this little excavation with the other one over there. A lot of rock in the middle of the caves, which probably partly explains why the deposition has been so uneven across the site. It's probably, if one could empty out this site and look at it, it's probably a very complicated cave with patches of people choosing to live in one part of the cave for a while and filling that up, and then that completely changing the place that you then choose to live in. Then you might choose to live somewhere else and that fills up. And so it's a kind of piecemeal excavation, and you don't understand that unless you do quite extensive excavations across the whole surface, which is what we've tried to do. Interesting cross-cultural experiences between the French, who, I don't know if some of you will know, the French kind of invented Paleolithic archaeology and think that there's only one way to do it, and that's the French way. I hope we haven't got any French people here. But and so it's been a really interesting experience, you know, trying to negotiate how one can do these things. But it's been very profitable, I think, on all parts. That's Cedric explaining some of the stratigraphy in his trench. This is the mayor of Les Aisies. So if things did start in the Dordogne, this man is the mayor of this little town of Les Aisies in the Dordogne, which announces itself as the centre of world prehistory. That's on the board as you go into the town. And so that's also been an interesting experience, trying to talk to him about other parts of the world which might also have that kind of claim. This is Guillaume Porraz in one of the excavations, talking to the stratigraphy and making notes of what he's excavating through. So we've had 10 years of that, And it's a very complicated stratigraphy. It's not a kind of layer cake, you know. It's very, very complicated lenses. Most of the stratigraphic units that we excavate are no bigger than a meter. They're small patches of ash or small patches of humified plant material or small patches of windblown sediment that form a very, very complicated stratigraphy. These labels are to just label the location of some of those strata. Then they get tidied up for publication, of course. That's the way that archaeologists deal with this. And so what you end up with in any one place is a complicated stratigraphy of labeled units. These are the units that we've removed, so we've systematically removed each layer from top to bottom, obviously. It's quite a nice stratigraphy. It doesn't show a lot of disturbance, so it's although it's complicated, it's very rewarding when you've done it. And you needn't worry too much about the detail on here, but then for each excavation it's necessary then to establish, and that's why we dug that very long trench across the site, because we needed to establish the relationships between excavated units that we'd found in one place and excavated units that we'd found in another place. It's a kind of South African tradition which was very hard for the French, I might tell you, that we name excavated units after people. Jean-Philippe, to this day, finds it very hard to talk about the unit Jeff. It's a battle, you know. So first he started putting Jeff in inverted commas, and now he's kind of getting used to it, but it was not their tradition, it was our tradition. So what happens is the excavated units get named in the different places, and these sections running across the site, which you'll recognize again. But then the excavation needs to be continuous so that it can link those things, so that we know that we've got all of these very small excavated units in the right chronological stratigraphic order. Obviously that's very important. And that's what that is showing. But then you've got to date them. It's all very well knowing that this unit is earlier than that unit, but how old is this unit and that unit? Is there 20,000 years between them, or are they, you know, very close together in time? And that's where this is Anne Wintle and Zenobia. That's where the data is coming. Now we knew already a long time ago that at the top of the site there was a little bit of very recent. The top few centimeters of the site is very recent. It's the last 2,000 years. But we knew that beneath those few centimeters, and sometimes right even at the surface, that we had very, very old deposits. We knew that because we could not date the charcoal or the bone or any other organic material in those units by radiocarbon dating. You only had to go a few centimeters down and you were beyond 40,000 years. So it seems that what's happened here is that people did live in this cave occasionally in the last 2,000 years, but prior to that people didn't visit the site for 40, perhaps even 50,000 years. There was nobody here. And then when you peel off this little veneer of later Stone Age, you get to deposits that are too old to date by radiocarbon dating, and that's why Anne, who was somewhat of a pioneer in luminescence dating. And the principle that they... Oh dear, what have I done? Pressed the wrong button. Oh, okay. I'm much more comfortable with 50,000-year-old technology than this. But the principle that they're working on is these bits of sand and quartz grains are blowing around in the sunlight, and while they're in the sunlight, they're being bleached. In other words, that any radioactivity that's built up inside the sand grain has been released. Right? But as soon as that sand grain is buried and taken out of the sun, effectively, radioactive elements in the quartz begin to accumulate, and they act as a little clock. So that little sand grain is a clock sitting in the sediment. And if it's buried for 50,000 years, 50,000 years worth of radioactivity will build up in that little sand grain. And if you then take it at night, obviously, you know, into your lab, and you release that radioactivity, you know how long it's been buried. Okay, that's the principle in a nutshell of what and Zenobia are doing. So that's what they're doing. They're collecting sediment from all of these layers so that they can, and I might tell you that they measure thousands of sediments from each layer. It's a very laborious business, which was kind of mastered, which was kind of perfected by Anne and Zenobia and is now widely used. Okay, so, and they throw out they throw out grains that are not behaving properly. Now I can see your mind saying, "Oh, how do they know that?" But anyway, that's another story. But they arrive at an age for each of these stratigraphic horizons based on the modal value, if you like, the modal age of those sediments that are there. All right? And that's what they're doing. Now, Chantal works on a different way. She works with thermoluminescence. So what she's looking for is bits of burnt artifact, a stone artifact that's been burnt by lying next to a fire. And the fire has heated it. And the fire's done what sunlight does. It's zeroed the radioactivity in the quartz. Okay? So by being next to the fire, hopefully the fire's temperature has been high enough, but it's zeroed that stone artifact, and then as it cools, it begins to accumulate radioactivity again. So what Chantal does, she takes the artifact into the lab, not a piece of sediment, and she does, and she releases the radioactivity in the form of light, measures it, and therefore knows how long since the artifact was heated up. Okay. The discrepancy is simply that the dates that we're getting from the burnt artifacts are much more variable. So in a particular horizon, Chantal might have dated 3 or 4 of these artifacts, and their dates are not very tightly distributed. They're quite wide, and you can see that here. This is the this is the time depth at the top, and from a particular layer, let's say Kim and Larry, which are these here, you can see that those 5 pieces of burnt stone are distributed over about 20,000 years. And it seems a bit unlikely that it took 20,000 years for such small lenses of deposit to accumulate. So, whereas Zenobia's dates are much tighter, and so if Zenobia were here, she would be saying, you know, you can't believe these TL dates. You know, you've got to believe the OSL dates, because we'll narrow this down. But you can see that as you go down through the stratigraphy, you are getting older. So there's room for some debate here about whether we've got very good, accurate, precise dates here. But you can see that most of the dates that both techniques are getting are older than 65,000 years for the layers that I'm going to be talking about. In addition, Chris Miller and Paul Goldberg take these little blocks of sediment and they infiltrate them with resin and section them, and they can say some really interesting things about the sediment from those. They can detect disturbance, they can see whether there's been water passing through, they can, you know, lots of interesting statements about the sedimentation that they can get out of that. And you can see here are the dates. So in a nutshell, I suppose we've got a sequence here of evidence that goes from 120,000 up to about 50,000 years at the top. That's the important time period, as you'll see in southern Africa. It's 120 to 50,000 will give you the time period when our species emerged. So the collection of evidence that we can make from these horizons, very important from the point of view of the origins of our species. I'll go through this very quickly because it's not, but basically the stone artifact sequence, which is the kind of anchor sequence for the whole thing. There's a little veneer of later Stone Age material in the last 2,000 years, and then immediately you're down to dates of about 50,000 years or more. And And the stone artifacts in there are, one can divide into a series of different kinds of Middle Stone Age assemblages. The reason why this is important and why I'm boring you a bit with it is because in here there are some really interesting, innovative things. There are some artifacts in here that if you were a European archaeologist, you would not be expecting to see at 60 or 70 or 80,000 years ago. You'd be expecting to see them at 20 or 30,000 years ago. And I'll show you what some of these things look like. So let's not dwell too much on that sequence. In particular, there are these beautiful leaf-shaped, these are two faces of the same artifact, and that's a side view there. Beautifully bifacially flaked leaf-shaped points. You do get these in Europe rather later, and there are lots of them there. And then there are these very nice segment-shaped artifacts where one curved edge has been blunted, and this is the original edge of the flake here, but the other one has been very carefully blunted by some flaking. And these again are things that you'd not be expecting to see in Europe at this time. You'd expect to be seeing them a lot later. Here's a kind of snapshot of the sequence. Towards the bottom there are these bifacially retouched points. They're very beautiful. And there are flake scars on both of these surfaces, so these have been very carefully retouched into this kind of, it's broken at the bottom there, but this kind of leaf-shaped point. There's another one here. And with them are many, many pieces of ochre. This is hematite or other ferruginous material that's been taken and been beveled. It seems people have collected these nodules of ochre and they've ground them on a piece of quartzite or some kind of little stone platform to get the powder. That's the material from which people make paint. So this is the pigment, and you can see the beveling, and certainly there. I hope you'll be able to see all those striations. They're very carefully striated, and this has even been worked to a kind of pencil shape. So there are lots and lots of these. Now, you know, these are the kinds of things that you would expect to find in the Upper Paleolithic, but you wouldn't expect to find with Neanderthal people in the Middle Paleolithic. And some of the stone artifacts. But really the most interesting kind of artifact from the site, and the one that I'm going to dwell on now, are these pieces of ostrich eggshell. This is a small piece. Here's a scale here. This is about 1.5 centimeters, so this is about 2 by 1.5 centimeters. But you can see that it's been very clearly inscribed, and this one has in fact got a kind of cross-hatching pattern on. And from some of these layers, particularly the layers with these backed segments here, we've got 300 or 400 now of these pieces. So there are lots of them, and they're very carefully made. These are the segments with the backing around the curved edge. And these are some of the blades that are innovative and precocious, if you like. These are very carefully struck, very elongated blades, struck with a soft hammer. In other words, they were not struck with a piece of stone, but with a piece of hard bone or something like that. And to find those kinds of blades at 65, 70,000 years ago is extremely unusual. And you wouldn't find it in Europe. These are some of the platforms here. And it's some of the characteristics of the back of the platform and the shape of the platform that tells you what kind of what kind of hammer people were using to flake them. And then there are also some very nice notched blades. There's a closer view of that beautiful piece of ochre, very carefully beveled, and there are quite a few flakes with ochre on. This is a perfectly normal piece of stone, flake, but you can see that it's got ochre all over the outer part of the flake there. It's very interesting in today's Guardian. I don't know if you saw this article. I found it just before I came, so I had to bring it along. But this is really what it's all about, because what João Zilão, who's the professor of archaeology at Bristol, I was very intrigued at first as to why Neanderthalers in southern Spain were under national in the Guardian, but I see it's because João is he's at Bristol University. But he's making the argument there that Neanderthals weren't as stupid as we've often made them out to be, and I'm certainly hoping that I'm not giving that impression. I think what's emerging is that Neanderthal people were developing in very much the same way, it seems to me, as modern people in Africa were, but perhaps not to the same extent. And I think as an evolutionist, one would have to believe that whatever they were capable of, they were... The modern people, when they arrived in Europe, certainly had some kind of competitive advantage that allowed them to outcompete and replace them fairly quickly. But his point there that's being commented on in The Guardian is that some Neanderthal people were capable of making beads, perforating pieces of shell and hanging them as beads. And I was interested in the date, it's about 50,000 or so. So certainly the situation seems to be that many of these behaviors, as I'm going to try and persuade you, were happening much earlier in Africa than they were in Europe. But later Neanderthal people were doing very similar kinds of things. And then the debate then becomes, were they doing that because they were copying incoming modern people into Europe, or was their developmental sequence just rather similar and they were getting to that stage, but as I say, apparently not effective enough to resist the penetration of modern people from Africa. Some of the stone tools there. And what we're also, another issue that's quite prominent in trying to make the case that modern people were more effective in utilizing their landscape and is their acquisition of stone. And so we're very keen to try and locate on the landscape around Diepkloof the sources of raw materials that were being transported to Diepkloof and used. And the suggestion is that modern people were much more effective at collecting, recognizing, collecting, and using flakeable stones from across the landscape than were their predecessors. The other amazing feature of these layers in Diepkloof are the hearths. Cedric is excavating a beautiful hearth here, and this is quite an amazing hearth. What you could see in the hearth is pieces of wood going into the hearth, and the outer part of the wood was unburnt, and then as the stick got into the fire, it was charred and burnt. And this is 65,000 years old. And certainly Jean-Philippe and Pierre-Jean, who dug a lot of caves in the Dordogne, and in fact at first I wondered what they were doing coming to South Africa when they had all those caves of their own, but the reason why they came was because they knew that in France the sites that they were digging had a replacement event. They had Neanderthals replaced by modern people. They wanted to come to a place where there was no replacement event, where people were gradually becoming modern and you had a kind of continuity without a replacement of Neanderthals by modern people. And they said to me, you know, in sites of equivalent age we would never find a hearth like this, you know, with that kind of preservation. What you can do, of course, is you can take charcoal from there and you can identify the range of woods that were used for the charcoal to make the fire. So Caroline Cartwright has been doing. That simultaneously gives you some information about people's collecting strategies, but also gives you some information about the paleoclimate at the time. Big later Stone Age excavation down into the these are the horizons, 50,000 going back to 120,000, and you can see that there's a big pit going down through there. Very interesting, actually. What we concluded was that these later Stone Age people were making tiny little artifacts. They were using very small cores. They were driving off tiny little blades and flakes to make little thumbnail scrapers. The reason the artifacts were small was because they were mounting them in mastic. So they didn't really need a very big stone. They just had a little bit of stone with some mastic and perhaps a wooden handle on it. So they could scrape skins, and they needed little needle-like blades to put on the end of their arrows and so on. So they were making microlithic artifacts. But occasionally, obviously, they needed a big flake for some purposes. And what they seem to have realized is there were lots of big flakes around. You didn't need to make them. All you needed to do was dig a hole down into the Middle Stone Age. It would be fascinating, you know, to know what they thought they were doing by digging that hole down into the, you know, the layers of their ancestors. But I don't know that we can do that, but we certainly can demonstrate that they were doing that. They were digging these holes, they were collecting nice big square flakes, and they were mounting them. And the interesting thing, that it appears to be women who were doing this. Well, at least I think so, because the artifacts that they were making from these nice big flakes were the kinds of artifacts that women used to sharpen and resharpen their digging sticks. And so I've written about this, and I think there's quite an interesting story to be made about that. But anyway, there's one of the pits. And there were lots of these pits going down through the MSA. And when you find these flakes that have been used, you can show by the patination on the flakes that they're old flakes that were reused later. Very interesting story. There's also quite good preservation of plant materials down there. This is a piece of protea. But these are seeds from various plants, and the morphology of the seeds can tell us which species they are. So we can make a story about food gathering. There's also quite a lot of bone. I thought the bone was quite well preserved, but the people who are looking at the bone say it's awful. It's quite fragmentary. But that's clearly the mandible of a antelope of some kind. And this is a very interesting, this is two views of a whale barnacle. This is a barnacle that only lives on whales and only lives on certain species of whales. Site is about 17 or 18 kilometers from the coast now, but may have been a bit further on occasions. So there were, and we are finding some marine shellfish back at the site. And occasionally a piece of seal bone or a piece of seabird. So they're clearly using the coast. It would be very interesting to have a site nearer to the coast, because I think they were using the coast quite extensively. That's important to me because obviously I've been interested in where did this encephalization come from? Where did this development of this large... How can we afford such a large brain? You know, brain is very expensive tissue. It takes up 20% of your metabolic energy. And how, you know, and what it's made up of is mostly, of course, fatty acid. And so what you really need, if you're going to be a species that specializes in a very big, complicated, complexly wired brain, is you need a lot of fatty acid. And where's that? It's all in the sea. So one of the interesting ideas that's quite commonly, I think, believed in southern Africa now, and it seems to be growing worldwide, is that there's a kind of sequence going on here. There's a point where our ancestors began extensively to exploit marine resources, thereby giving women who were supporting a fetus with growing brain requirements with a good supply of those fatty acids. So omega-3 that's in all your chemist shops and so on, right? And that in turn allowed whatever evolutionary pressures there were to develop a bigger brain and a more complexly wired brain to happen, and that in turn manifested itself in a lot of these very innovative behaviors, right? So that's the kind of sequence that I've suggested, and I think it's catching on. So these kinds of things are very important. I might say that many of the other sites that are being excavated are right on the coast and are full of shells. So we know that from 120,000 years on, at least, perhaps even 160,000 years on, people are substantially exploiting marine resources in southern Africa. And you will be very hard put to find that anywhere else in the world. Gibraltar, you know, Atlantic, North Africa, Italy have some shell middens back to maybe 60 or 70,000 years. But the earliest shell middens are in southern Africa, and the earliest modern people are in those shell middens. It was, for a while, traditional for archaeologists to say, oh, well, when people got smart, they saw all these shellfish, and they thought, well, great, looks like food, let's eat it. You know, I don't think so. I think it was the other way around. I think it was some probably environmental circumstances that led to the greater exploitation of those shellfish, which in turn allowed for larger brains to be afforded. Well, what about these people? That's, I'm afraid, it from Diepkloof. From many of these Middle Stone Age sites in southern Africa, we do have skeletal remains, and they are all modern. So at 120,000 years ago, the people in southern Africa who are doing these things that I'm talking about are modern people. their remains are indistinguishable from us. They are our species. Whereas at the same time, people were Neanderthal in Europe and remained Neanderthals in Europe for another 60, 70, perhaps even 80,000 years. So the biological evolution to modernity had happened in Africa by 120,000 years ago, at least. And those are people who are gathering shellfish. At that stage, 120,000 years ago, there's not a lot of evidence for innovative behavior. So those beautiful blades, those innovative patterns of stone artifact making, not so common there, hard to demonstrate, and some of the other things that I'll talk about now, not so common there. They emerge after 100,000 years ago. But anyway, so we've got a little deciduous tooth and a bit of toe. Not a lot. It would have been nice to have got more. But in some of the other sites, there are lots of pieces of crania. There are by and large the durable parts of the body. There are lots of bits of mandible, some parts of the cranium, bits of maxilla. And if you match those fragmentary parts up to modern people, whatever dimensions you can take from them fall within the range of variation of our species. So we're modern by then in Africa, but not in Europe. There's no evidence that any of these modern people were being buried. So this is very interesting, because we know that Neanderthal people were burying their dead 60, 70,000 years ago. There's no evidence that modern people in Africa were burying their dead. So in that sense, Neanderthal people were doing something that was more innovative, if one likes to think of it that way, than African modern people. But from a very particular set of horizons, am I still alive? Yes. In this cave, we have found these fragments of ostrich egg that are marked, and I think this is very important, because it's possible, I think, to describe these and understand them in a way that shows us what this encephalization was capable of producing. In what sense we can begin to think that these people were modern. Not only biologically modern, but behaviorally modern. They were seeing the world and dealing with it in a way that we would recognize as the way that modern hunter-gatherer people all across the globe do. These are some of the early ones that we found. They're not white. Ostrich eggs, obviously you've seen them, they're yellowy white. All of these have been burnt, so all of this orangey colour, it's not ochre, they've not been painted. They've been charred or heated or burnt to various levels. So some of them are just that rather beautiful maroon colour. Some of them are very grey and black and heavily burnt. But they've very clearly been marked. When we found the first two of these, one of my colleagues said, well, he's seen hyenas pick up ostrich eggs, and sometimes their teeth might kind of score the egg, and so, you know. But I'm sorry. You know, when you've got parallel lines like this and rather fainter parallel lines paralleling them, this is not a hyena. This is intentional marking of these eggs. And what we also noticed was that this acute angle kept regularly reappearing. Anyway, we've got lots of them now, and these are some of them. And it's extremely important. These are 65,000 years old. So they're 25 or 30,000 years before these kinds of things appear in Europe, replacing the Neanderthals with that creative explosion of, you know, cave painting and carving in bone and ivory and so on. Now, you know, it's a moot point as to whether you call it art. I don't really mind what you call it. I'm more interested in what it appears to be. In this case, you'll see all of these are coming from the same horizon. They're all from Frank. Frank is a little lens, 1.5 meters across, maybe 2 meters across, a few centimeters deep. And they're very interesting because they show us that, perhaps I just need to back off a bit here. Quite frequently, archaeologists claim to have the earliest this or the earliest that. In fact, all the time they seem to make those kinds of claims. It seems to be how you make a living as an archaeologist. But other archaeologists will say, oh yeah, but you know, you've only got one of them. You know, so they'll say it's not yet hardwired, built into people's behaviour. It's just something that somebody did and gone. You know. Well, there are 350 pieces of this now. And in this one horizon, you can see that this kind of tram line or a railway line pattern or hatched band pattern is recurrent. But it's very repetitive. They're always, you can see when you microscopically look at this, they're always drawing the parallel lines first, and then they're always putting the bars, the sleepers if you like, across the railway line next. In other words, there's a repetitive pattern of the production of this design. And it is repetitive. You know, here it is again, here it is here it is here. Here it's reproduced 3 times on the same egg. Okay? It's a small piece. Here's the scale. Right? So these are small pieces. But, you know, the distance between the railway lines, the distance between the sleepers, the length, you know, that can vary. So here you've got something that's very interesting. It's something that's repeated, but which has the capacity for individuals to manipulate it and vary it, right? Now, that's very, very interesting. At 65,000 years ago, that people are intentionally marking these ostrich eggshells with patterns that were mutually intelligible means that people had clearly got to the stage where they're putting out into their landscape, perhaps only into their cave, but probably almost certainly on a wider scale as well. They're putting out their reference points that they could all interpret and understand. There's a language here which is which is capable of making sense to people. And I'm pretty sure that that's what's happening here. This is interestingly a different one. It's got a central line, and it's got these rather curved lines that curve in a different way either side of the central one. And Pierre-Jean's been very interested in this piece because he reckons that the egg need to have been turned from making these ones to making those ones, and he also thinks he can tell whether this is a right-handed or left-handed person, but, well, I'm not sure. It's possible. The important thing is we know a lot about marking of ostrich eggshells from ethnographic hunter-gatherers of the last few hundred years, because we know that people who live in the Kalahari still do it. They mark their eggs, and they mark them mostly as marks of ownership, but sometimes they're marking what's in the egg, and so there could be lots of reasons why people want to mark an egg. But what they're doing when they're putting that marking on is they're turning you know, probably an ostrich could tell one egg from another, and and maybe a hunter-gatherer of the Kalahari could, but it's very hard to tell one ostrich egg from another. They are eggs, you know. But as soon as you put that tram line on, it's your egg. It's that egg. It's not an egg, it's that egg. You know, it's been transformed. And of course, there's a certain structure about the egg, because a lot of these eggs that are being decorated are, in fact, water flasks. They're water containers. They're being used for transporting and storing water. Now, this is another very interesting kind of behavior. So what we've got here is, and let me just show you the next slide before I go any further. What you can see is that, in fact, on this drawing here, you can see that little curve there. That's the opening of the egg there. And so is this, and so is this. And many of these decorative motifs, sorry, I've had a little internal battle over the last 15 years as to whether I should call this decoration. It's probably silly, but let me call them intentionally marked eggs. Where often this intentional marking is focused on the perforation. Let me go back now. So very often it's, and you can see actually on this piece, well, you probably can't see actually, but I can tell you that there are 4 lines radiating out there from the perforation. That it was focused on the perforation, and I think this probably was too, but that may not have been. We've tried very hard to see whether we wouldn't be able to tell whether the decorative, you see we've got little fragments from here or wherever. We've tried to say, well, can we tell whether the fragment is up there near the pole, if you like, or whether it's on the equator? And if you've got a big enough length of curvature, you can begin to do that. But we need to do some more refitting to get bigger, to put our little fragments into bigger fragments before we can really, I think, effectively start to do that. But we do know that on occasion, well, we know that some at least of these eggs were already being turned into water flasks and water storage objects. Which is, and if we go back to Frank again, what this would mean is it's quite likely that in Frank we've got the remains probably of 5 different water flasks there, because it looks unlikely as though these are going to be from the same piece. It's possible, but because of the difference in patterning, perhaps not. So what we've got here then is we've got a package here, if you like. We've got some very innovative stone tool flaking. We've got some manipulation of organic raw materials, in this case ostrich egg, which begins to sound like the package that appears in Europe between 40 and 35,000 years ago. And we've got it associated with anatomically modern people, who are the people who appear with this package in Europe. But the interesting thing is that it disappears in Africa. It's a pattern. Sorry, these are some of the pieces and some of the analyses that Pierre-Jean is doing to analyze some of the different markings. What we've got in southern Africa then is we've got these innovative behaviors which, in stone tool making, in extensive use of ochre, in marking of ostrich eggshells, and use of ostrich eggshells as containers, all that at Diepkloof. At some other sites we've got the use of marine shells, perforating marine shells to use them as beads. We've got the marking of ochre. You may have seen that in some of these caves, pieces of ochre also have crosshatch markings on. And we've got recently suggestions that people are actually able to heat some of the rocks that they're flaking in order to make them more flakeable, more manipulable. There's still a lot of argument about this, but it's been a claim that you've probably seen in science recently. So there's a whole bunch of innovative behaviors that appear by about 75,000 years ago and disappear at about 55,000 years ago. We have Middle Stone Age in Diepkloof up going around 50,000 years, and all of this is gone. So the appearance of these behaviors is interesting, but the disappearance is also interesting and somewhat puzzling. And it obviously is the focus of a lot of ongoing research. And I might also tell you that now, not only João finding these perforated shell beads in Spain, but there are similar beads now in Mediterranean Algeria, Morocco, and I think you're going to find the same kind of case that I'm making for early innovative behavior. You're going to find it in North Africa. East Africa is different because these crania that I'm describing as rather dubiously dated are not associated with any innovative behavior at all. So the East African case is purely being made on the basis of the skeletal remains. It'll be interesting to see what happens there. And obviously Southern Africa is a long way from Europe. So the geography of this, there's huge amounts of work to be done. We know very little about how to connect these things. There's two possibilities, several possibilities, but one possibility is that these kinds of innovative behaviors, marking organic objects, making beads, stone tool making, these just kind of flare up occasionally in different places and don't catch on. They last for a while, then the reasons for their existence appear. So they're not really connected. Right, that's a possibility. It's a possibility that archaeologists are increasingly able to assimilate. I think 20 or 30,000 years ago, the tendency was to move towards connecting these things. The tendency now is to allow these things to flare up and to be similar to one another, but not necessarily to be historically connected, and that might be interesting. That might be what's happening here. This is what I've been interested in expanding from Diepkloof to other sites. I think it's quite likely that regular shellfish and other marine food composition led to more rapid encephalization in ways that we could talk about if you like, and thereby to the increased innovation which we see in the form of these ostrich eggshell pieces of ochre, beads, and so on and so forth. And is it when we get that process more better evidenced and when we get it better described and better understood, is that what will allow us to talk about, you know, the appearance of modern people? And will it help us to understand why it's happening in certain parts of the world under certain climatic circumstances rather than in others? Well, thank you very much for listening.